This video is brought to you by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you wish to support the channel and allow me to dedicate more time to producing such videos, you can do so with a small monthly donation on patreon.com/balkanodyssey. Human nature. A concept we all take for granted, as we have a feeling that we naturally know what it entails. Selfishness, greed, a dose of corruption and malevolence when it comes down to taking care of your own ass. Those are the qualities that have allegedly shaped our societies throughout history, and continue to be the main traits of each and every human being, according to liberals and conservatives. But what about human nature would be one of the first learned catchphrases deployed in opposition to the concept of communism, implying that humans could never be so selfless and community-oriented, and that the concept of communism is therefore utopian, childish, naive, and against human nature. However, if we look through history more carefully, this couldn't be farther from the truth. This reaction is more of a mindless defense mechanism when confronted with the alternative to our current social and political organization, and is a clear sign of our inability to perceive anything else but the status quo. The institutions and mechanisms sustaining and reproducing capitalist neoliberal democracy have ideologically conditioned our subconscious into accepting the status quo as the peak and final stage of human development, and stripped us of the ability to imagine a different world, or even properly perceive the very dynamic historical development of human societies and behavior. So-called Fukuyamaism is the embodiment of this assertion, suggesting that by achieving liberal democracy, we have reached the end of history. In the same way that the monarchs and aristocrats of old have justified their existence by the virtue of eternal divine right, the modern capitalist class justifies itself with human nature, which is allegedly a mirror of natural hierarchies that are necessary to keep society in order. These hierarchies are justified and compared to those found in nature, with Jordan Peterson's infamous lobster theory. However, the trans-historical concept of human nature as a static, eternal thing, disconnected from the dynamics of the material world, is not only incredibly silly, but flat out wrong if we approach it scientifically. We can do this by viewing the development of human societies through the lens of dialectical materialism, the underlying philosophy that served as the foundation of the Marxist conception of history. By doing so, we can finally and definitively debunk this rather lazy gotcha phrase and put it to bed. In case you're unfamiliar with dialectical materialism, here's a short explanation. Dialectics is the philosophical method of observing the world as intricately interconnected and interdependent, in constant motion, development, and change, propelled forward by the resolving of contradictions, which result in the perpetual motion of everything in the universe. In the words of Friedrich Engels, the dialectic is, as a matter of fact, nothing but the science of the universal laws of motion and evolution in nature, human society, and thought. Furthermore, materialism is the notion that the material world, perceptible to the human senses, exists in an objective reality independent from thought, mind, and spirit. It rejects the use of metaphysical concepts such as human nature, the soul, or God, specifically when it comes to the thorough observation of history and social relations. Essentially, it's a purely scientific approach towards understanding the development of nature and society. As Engels eloquently explains in the introduction to Anti-Düring, if we derive the scheme of the universe, not from our own brain, but merely by the means of our own brain, from the material world, we need no philosophy, but simply knowledge of the world and what occurs in it. And the results of this knowledge likewise do not constitute a philosophy, but positive science. I've already talked about this in the first edition of this series, while discussing the fundamental concepts of Marxist thought, so if you're not familiar with this, I strongly advise you to watch that video. Nonetheless, a very basic understanding of this concept is more than sufficient to immediately see why a default, trans-historical concept such as human nature is meaningless and inconsistent with how the universe operates. If we apply the dialectic method to the entire timeline of human history, we can observe an objective fact. Human societies have gone through several different forms of political and economic organization, from an initial phase of tribal organization in what can be described as primitive communism, through slave society, feudalism, and now capitalism. Each one of these stages of historical development is characterized by a progressively slightly different form of modes of production, scientific progress, and consequently adapted social relations, with development perpetuated through constant class struggle between the haves and have-nots, the owners of the means of production, and the vast laboring masses. And this is the crux of the matter. These ever-changing forces have continually propelled society forward and changed the characteristics of what some would call human nature. This is an incredibly plastic, adaptable, and ever-changing phenomenon, and is therefore, just like everything else, subject to dialectical development. It is not static, unchangeable, and eternal, as ideologues of capital would suggest. It changes and adapts in par with the material conditions of the given era, not the other way around. Therefore, observing human nature under the conditions of capitalism and coming to the conclusion that this must be how human behavior and organization has always been is palpably false and short-sighted. One quote perfectly summarizes the absurdity of such thinking. To look at people in capitalist society and conclude that human nature is egoism is like looking at people in a factory where pollution is destroying their lungs and saying that it is human nature to cough. Essentially, our current global mode of production, based on the private ownership of the means of production and the binary class system, whose contradictions unavoidably necessitate class struggle, rewards ruthless competition in the endless pursuit of profit and self-interest. In the era of global capitalism, we perceive it as natural to work for monetary incentives because we have no other choice. As a laborer, if you don't work for money and compete with other workers in the pursuit of the best possible position, for example, you will probably starve. When things start to unravel and get desperate, people indeed start to seem greedy and ruthless to secure a means of sustenance for their family. But goddammit, they're not doing it for the fun of it, but out of necessity. We are forced to view everything through a monetary lens, not because we have a deep-seated love for money, but because money can provide a prosperous, careless existence for our families. We live in a system where such an existence is acquirable only through greed and selfishness. Besides, how can anything related to money, itself a universal commodity for exchange, a fairly recent development, be in human nature if it has only existed for only a brief, minuscule part of human history? Now, if we look at things from the capitalist point of view, if you don't compete with the rest of the market and deploy ethically questionable practices in your pursuit of profit, you will be swallowed by the competition. If you wish to rise to the top, you must use all means necessary to increase profits, which often means increasingly ruthless exploitation of workers, poor safety regulations, union busting, cuts on maternity leave, sick pay, vacation, and other basic necessities, as well as careless pollution of the environment, dishonest advertising, predatory monopolization of the market, among other things, all of which you are commanded to do by the merciless need of capital to grow and accumulate, whether it's going to be you doing it or someone else. Essentially, it's not the malevolence and evil of the individual capitalist as a person that compels him to behave in such a way, but the fact that he is a slave to the merciless forces of capital. He serves capital the same way that the workforce serves him. It's a cold, systemic force that cannot be tamed with individual moral enlightenment and more ethical practices. It is the socioeconomic system that compels humans to behave a certain way and makes greediness look natural and essential. Assuming that this has been this way throughout the entirety of human history is silly to say the least. The scientific observation of primeval tribes that were still intact and isolated from the rest of civilization back in the 1800s has provided us with invaluable information about the forms of organization that existed before capitalism. It's provided us with insights into the systems of kinship, sexual organizations, and property relations of Native American tribes, such as those in the Sandwich Islands of Hawaii and the Iroquois in North America, but also ancient civilizations such as the Greeks and Romans. Observations documented by pioneering American anthropologist Lewis H. Morgan. These investigations were articulated and given context by Friedrich Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, through a delicate argument about how new material conditions morphed the initial structure of the family and what he calls the gens, and gave rise to private property and patriarchal inheritance, and ultimately to the state and its institutions as we know them today, in what can be described as the backbone of historical materialism, the Marxist conceptual apparatus for observing history. We will tackle this incredibly profound and important observation in a separate video and give it the attention it deserves. For now, however, we only need to acknowledge a single all-encompassing discovery, a very intuitive one at that, namely that the socioeconomic foundation of human societies has morphed and evolved throughout history. We haven't always lived under capitalism. We haven't always worked for profit, nor have we always inherited wealth over generations according to patriarchal law. We haven't always had the state as the coercive organization of violence as it is. We haven't always had money, borders, bureaucratic institutions, and so on and so on. Before the advent of these inventions, humans have, for thousands of years, organized communally, with little to no hierarchy and according to matriarchal law, all of which is universally observable in these primeval societies. There was no such thing as private property. There was no profit, no capital accumulation. These phenomena have been slowly introduced over centuries, parallel to the occurrence of new material conditions, an increase in our productive capacities, and the consequent surplus and individual accumulation of material wealth that gave rise to the patriarchy, to private property, money, and the state. How is it, then, that we dare to insist that capitalism is in human nature? How dare we suggest that a particular socioeconomic system that had existed for only 1% of recorded human history is the essence of what it means to be human? That the ugliest and most repulsive impulses drawn out of us by this wraith are the defining characteristics of human beings, such as selfishness, ruthlessness, and greed? Well, surprisingly, there is a simple explanation. Just like the slave owners used to preach of the natural order of things, just like the feudal lords and kings used to emphasize their divine right to rule, so do the contemporary capitalists speak of meritocracy, equality of opportunity, and natural hierarchies that justify their privileged position of power. Every system is enveloped by an ideology that aims to sustain and reproduce it, that has the task of representing the current state of affairs as the natural order of things, as they've always been, or, in the case of capitalism, as the pinnacle of human development, the end of history. Capitalist ideology is so deeply engraved into our everyday activities that ideology itself has become synonymous with reality, inescapable, indiscernible from the human experience itself.
Usually we think ideology is as glasses which distort our vision, and to see reality you have to take off the glasses. I like this gentle, refined reverse that here on the opposite, it's the correct thesis of the film. Ideology is our natural state, and to see the truth you have to put on the glasses. The second thing that is important is that traditionally, ideology worked in the opposite way. The official message was this pure ethical one: obey, sacrifice yourself, and then you had to put glasses on to get the obscene under message. The examples that I always give, for example, in fascism, Nazism, the official message was enough of decadence, sacrifice yourself, work for the country. But then, in order to make this message functional, ideology bribed you with whatever. You can beat, you can steal, you can beat the Jews or whatever, or the dirty pleasures. Or in America, Ku Klux Klan. Officially, Christianity, we defend the white race. The truth of it was, what do you see when you put glasses on? Saturday evening, we gather, we rape some black girls, we lynch some blacks. So in traditional ideology, this surplus enjoyment, the dirty, obscene enjoyment, the way those in power bribe you to collaborate, is hidden. Today, it's almost the opposite. Ideology directly addresses you with pleasures. Enjoy, do it. So we need glasses to see the real image.
It haunts us at every step to remind us that this is how it has always been and always will be. Consequently, being apolitical and centrist is the most ideologically stained position to hold, as your political absence and impotence only solidifies the rule of the prevailing coercive forces. But you know better. Human nature is not a hindrance to the construction of a more just, democratic, egalitarian society, precisely because there is no such thing as human nature. There is only the capitalist status quo, and its desperate cries and pathetic justifications as it crumbles under the weight of its own contradictions.